Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of IHR TV. European Union, European Economic Area and Swiss citizens all need to apply through the European Union settlement scheme to secure their rights in the UK past the transition period. Critics of the EU SAS argue that not all citizens will have applied by the 30th of June 2021 deadline and those that don't will be deemed unlawful residents. Alexandra Bulat, project manager of the non-profit group Young Europeans, thank you for being with us today. What is the post-Brexit scenario for EU citizens living in the UK?
There's, practical impacts and also more emotional impacts on well-being, mental health, and so on. So, of course, in the practical implications, the main issue is the EU settlement scheme. So all EU EA citizens and their non-EU family members have to apply to the EU settlement scheme in order to be able to stay in the UK and continue living and working after Brexit. But other than those legal implications and how Brexit affects people's current rights, there's also wider implications on how people feel about the situation. So a lot of Europeans in this context reported feeling less welcome, perhaps. Others voiced concerns regarding, hate crime or other things, especially after the EU referendum. We saw a rise in hate crime and recorded hate crime in the UK.
You mentioned the EU settlement scheme. What are the main issues arising from it?
The deadline may seem a bit far away. The deadline is 30th of June 2021 to apply. But if you think about this, there could be hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands of people who will have no status, no legal basis to be in the UK. I've been campaigning on EU migrants' rights since after the referendum, but I'm also an immigration advisor, so I get to see firsthand those applications, and especially with communities and people who are more at risk, who perhaps need extra support to make those applications. So first thing that I would mention is that in 2016, when we had the referendum, EU citizens in the UK were promised by people who are in government right now, such as Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, even Priti Patel, our current Home Secretary, they were promised that nothing will change. So if you actually look at the campaign documents in the Vote Leave campaign, it's very clearly mentioned that if you vote to leave the EU, those who are already here, EU citizens already here, nothing will change for them. You'll preserve exactly the same rights. So a lot of people, I think, voted as well, not the EU citizens because we couldn't have a vote, but a lot of, the British public also voted with that in mind because everyone has EU citizens, friends, neighbors, colleagues, and they were promised everything will stay the same. Now, what happened after during the negotiations is that the UK chose to implement this application system. So there were two choices in the withdrawal agreement. The UK could have chosen to have what's called the constitutive system, in which you have the status, you preserve your rights, most of your rights, if you actually make a successful application to the scheme. But also the other option was to have what's called a declaratory system, in which those rights will have been protected by law, and then people could have registered to prove their status. The EU settlement scheme is an application system. It's what's called a constitutive system. So you only preserve those rights if you make a successful application, and those who won't apply, for example, if some people won't apply on time by the deadline, after the deadline, if you don't have a status under the scheme, technically speaking, legally speaking, you are unlawfully resident in the UK. And here is, I think, where the issues are, because if you look at similar schemes across the world, similar registration or application schemes, I didn't find, and no one finds any scheme that reaches 100% of its audience, so to speak, in time.
You could argue that EU citizens have been given plenty of time to apply the EU settlement scheme. The deadline is not until June 2021. Why haven't some people applied yet? What are the causes for people being left out?
Every single information session I do on Facebook, for example, or on YouTube or on different platforms, I still find people who find out about the settlement scheme from those information sessions for the first time now. This has to do with many different issues, has to do with how you do outreach, how you inform, how the government is actually able to inform everyone who has to apply. But it's also down to individuals actually knowing their rights in the UK, and often you have a lot of people I worked with in the communities, they perhaps have an indefinite leave to remain from the past, or they have a permanent residence card under EU law, or they have another type of document from the Home Office. And in some cases, they will still have to go through the scheme and secure their status. Think about students, for example, or younger Europeans working in London. So you'd assume those people are quite easy to reach. They tend to speak English well. They're digitally literate. They have smartphones. Usually they can go through the online application. They don't have any digital or language barriers in most cases. However, when I did a research project with focus groups, with community researchers within London, most of the people who participate in our focus groups hadn't applied yet, and there were a range of reasons, and ranging from people who said, I already have a document from the Home Office. For example, they were registered with the Workers' Registration Scheme, or had a permanent residence card, or the blue registration certificate under EA regulations, and they didn't know that those documents won't be valid anymore because we leave the EU, and that they will have to exchange even for a permanent residence card if you're not planning to use it for citizenship now. I mean, very soon, that document on its own will have to be exchanged for settled status, because you need a status in UK law, and those EEA regulations don't apply anymore soon in the future. Some people thought that their student status would exempt them from applying, saying, but I'm a student, why do I have to apply? I'm legally here. Some people would thought that I've been in the country for a long time, and they wrongly thought, they're wrongly informed by perhaps friends or kind of family circles, word of mouth, that this scheme is for new entries in the UK. It's not for people who've been here for decades, paying taxes and having properties in the UK and so on. But there are also other interesting reasons of people thinking that, because especially for young people who may want to study abroad in the future, or perhaps spend time working abroad in another EU country or non-EU country, they thought, well, I don't necessarily know if I'm going to stay here long term. So the whole idea of settlement and being settled, they didn't necessarily translate it to, that's a legal requirement, I will have to have this status in law.
Did the Home Office identify any categories for people who could be potentially left out, and why is it hard to reach them?
I mean, there are different. So the Home Office has identified some categories of groups that they themselves consider at risk. Those are, for example, elderly people, Roma communities, children in care, victims of domestic violence, victims of trafficking, people in precarious work as well, in very precarious employment, who may struggle to prove their residence in the UK. The most worrying thing really is that if you don't know exactly how many people have to apply, how many people will have to be covered by the scheme, then you can't really know when the scheme has done its job and covered everyone. The issue here is, in the UK never had a registration system for EU migration like in other EU countries.
What kind of assistance do you provide? What kind of people have you met so far?
The most common questions, just from the top of my head now, it's people coming and showing me an old stamp in the passport, for example, or showing me a permanent residence documentation and saying, I already have this, I'm fine, right? And then you have to explain the very different types of indefinite leave and different types of residency. And also people who generally need support, like I assisted with applications from people who just didn't have the technology, people who didn't have a smartphone, who couldn't use the ID document check app, people who had mobility issues, they couldn't go to scan their ID somewhere else, they needed someone to come to their home. One of my colleagues had someone who was over 100 years old, who needed someone to come to their house. They've been living in the UK for 40, 50 years. Sometimes people's lives doesn't fit in a tick box or a very neat application form. So people who are unsure how to prove their residency, or perhaps they don't have a very continuous track of employment or national insurance contributions, or perhaps they don't have access to all their documents. We had cases people lost their documents from the past. The settlement scheme, of course, the application is in English, and the Home Office Resolution Center, when you can call for support there for any questions, is also in English. So I think there's also some need of language advice that's targeted to different languages in different communities. From an emotional point of view, the difficult thing for me when I did this outreach and advise people to apply is that when people ask, I've been in the country for 40 years sometimes, why do I have still to apply to basically still be able to live in my home in the UK, where I own my house, where I paid all my taxes? And it's a very difficult conversation to have.
EU citizens don't get any physical proof of their settled status. They have to rely on a digital status. Why do you believe they need a physical document to prove their rights?
Yeah, so the 3 million conducted a survey in collaboration with Northumbria University a few months ago, and actually over 90% of EU citizens surveyed wanted to have a physical proof of status. So the government line is that they are moving towards a digital system. In the UK, we have those hostile environment set of policies that were especially developed during the Theresa May government. And this means that almost every step of the way, unless you're a British citizen, you need to prove that you are entitled to the things that you access. So every time I rent a place, for example, in the UK, now I show my Romanian passport because we're still in the EU. But after Brexit, I'll have to prove that I am lawfully resident and I have the right to rent. Right to work, again, every time even if I took a job as a student for a few hours, I'll have to prove my rights to work every time, again, through my passport. After Brexit, it will be through the status. So every step of the way in your access to services or work, you have to prove your status. And if you think about proving this through a digital system, this could create more discrimination, because if, for example, I have if it's me and another person who has a physical document, or a British citizen or migrant with a physical document, and we both want to rent the same place, which is easier, someone showing their document or me saying, well, you have to send an email, log into the email, put a security code, put my details, log in the system, then see my status, then you'll be able to print it from the system or whatever. So the printed, the letter that you receive via email when you receive your settled or pre-settled status, it states very clearly this is not proof of your status. It's quicker to show a document, indefinite leave to remain card or a passport, than to go through the digital system.
And I guess this is an issue for businesses as well, isn't it?
I heard from smaller business owners how they think they would struggle very much, especially if they have more short-term workers or in different areas of work, when you employ people like per different day projects, like different events and so on, or more creative industries. It's very difficult when you have to check this every few days for different projects.
What are the most urgent issues that need to be addressed to ensure that Brexit doesn't result in a loss of rights for EU citizens?
I think what's crucial to be done very soon, and which hasn't been done, is to provide a safety net, a safety bridge between this end of freedom of movement and the future immigration system. So we have the transition period ending, then we have another period before which the settlement scheme deadline is. So settlement scheme is June 2021. So it's unclear how things like right to work checks or right to rent checks will be conducted in that period, and whether people will be subject to more discrimination because we have this period that's not really in transition, but the settlement scheme is still open for applications. COVID massively affected the ability of the Home Office to process those applications. The urgent thing is also to think about whether this deadline works and whether there is capacity to process all those applications. But even if you had a good way to process the applications, there's the elephant in the room is still the fact that you still have people who won't have this settled or pre-settled status on time, and there needs to be some safeguard in place. But I also think in the context of COVID, what needs to take place urgently is to review the access to welfare and social security, because that's an issue that in the 3 million, most of the people who contact us in this period are EU citizens, mainly with pre-settled status, with limited leave to remain under the EU settlement scheme, who are rejected universal credit or other forms of social security. So that's an issue that urgently needs to be looked at in this context.
If you had one message to say to any European citizens living in the UK worried about their future, what advice would you give them?
First of all, do protect your rights. It's a requirement to get your status sorted. So do apply to the scheme before the deadline, so you make sure that you're not left behind, and it won't be very difficult for you to access your rights later on. But also, I would say get involved in your local community as well. There's many organizations working on migrant rights, many organizations working on informing others, community outreach, community research. So whatever your skill set, you can make a difference at the local level and make sure that your voice is heard.
Alexandra Bulat, thank you. And thank you for being with us for another episode of IHR TV. From myself, Margherita Cargasacchi, until next time, goodbye.